In the early 1960s, Santa Cruz was just an ordinary Californian beach town.
Santa Cruz was a model of conservatism, a tourist city dominated by the boardwalk and the beach.
Santa Cruz was a very friendly, slow-paced community to live in back then.
It was pretty much a retirement town at that time. There was no University of California, there was no UC campus there at the time. It was just a very quaint, small community. It felt very safe and very pleasant.
It was this peaceful community that the Ota family decided to make home. Tragically for them, it wouldn't remain peaceful for long.
Dr. Victor Ota and his family were very, very well known in the city of Santa Cruz and actually in the county of Santa Cruz and beyond. He was a noted, well-respected ophthalmologist.
My father, he was a person who came from a very poor background and did very well for himself. He was just sort of a bigger-than-life character, handsome and generous and friendly.
Dr. Ota was my eye doctor, and I remember him as being a very, very nice man, very gentle.
My mother also came from a working-class background. She was Czechoslovakian, my father was Japanese. So if our home and our lifestyle was anything, it was much more Japanese. My mother was also very stylish and perfect looking. It's just, moms were like that then, I guess.
Victor and Virginia Ota had what many locals considered to be the perfect family.
My older sister was, Tara was 3 years older than I was, and she was artistic and an artist and beautiful. She was also a model. And then I had 2 brothers that were, Derek was 3 years younger than I, and Tag was 4 years. Tag was just one of those little boys that was just the sweetest, cutest kid in school, and everybody loved. He was just gorgeous. Derek was much more artistic and darker, a little more brooding and more complicated.
Thought of as almost another family member was the doctor's secretary, Dorothy Cadwallader.
My Aunt Dorothy, she was a wonderful woman, you know. All-American, apple pie, the whole works.
She was the most beautiful woman. She was soft-spoken and perfect. She was like, just to me, I just idolized her.
Completing the perfect family unit was the dream home the Otas built in the Santa Cruz foothills.
It was as much part of our life as a person in our family, that home and the process of building it. Even the fabrics inside the house, my mother wove on a loom. It was built completely into nature. There were no trees cut down to build the home.
Dr. Ota liked natural setting. I can remember that the windows didn't have any coverings on them. He liked to look out into the forest and liked a lot of natural stonework around the home.
It wasn't a time that you thought of where anything bad would ever happen.
But in the late 60s, Santa Cruz changed forever. The hippie generation descended on the area in their thousands.
You started seeing a lot of people dropping out and going to live with nature.
It was huge here. Some people were growing their own food. Some of them worked. They were artists, musicians. A lot of people on food stamps, probably.
And it wasn't all peace and love.
Well, the 1960s are known as sort of the decade of love and flower power and peace and harmony, but in many ways it had a darker side. It saw quite a few different revolutions. There was a sexual, political, psychedelic revolution, but one that doesn't get mentioned as much as the others was a kind of magical revolution that took place in the 1960s. It was more or less an occult revival.
I remember just up the way here, one of the communes where the inhabitants would put on white robes and pointed hats and chanting in like a Celtic language and holding rituals. It was bizarre behavior that scared people.
There seemed to be a kind of free-for-all in the world of morality, which initially was very liberating, but at a certain point it seemed to have gone too far.
Nothing illustrated this more than when the cult hippie commune led by Charles Manson slaughtered 8 people in 1969. Most horrifyingly amongst the victims was the 8 months pregnant actress Sharon Tate.
California exploded in fear when the whole Tate LaBianca murders in LA and the Charlie Manson gang popped onto the newspapers and was covered internationally. It made people go, wow, what's happening? It did change, you know, the whole aura of peace and love and flower power to something strange to be fearful of, more criminal, more crazy.
Soon after the Manson murders, a terrifying crime would occur in Santa Cruz on America's west coast that would convince all that another killer cult was on the rampage.
My dad told me, I want you two to stay up here because there are 5 bodies in the pool.
In 1969, the Manson family murders had revealed a dark side to the hippie generation. Rumors of strange occult practices, talk of revolution and murder, had tainted the peace and love movement forever. And in 1970, a new crime would occur that would convince many that society was about to self-destruct.
This crime unfolds really with a report of a fire, smoke billowing from this small hilltop.
That night I was in class out at the community college. We were on a break and I heard the siren blowing. I got my fire gear because I knew where the fire was. The Otah residence.
As the firefighters arrive, they go up a winding kind of a driveway, and there's a car.
There was a Rolls Royce and a Lincoln blocking the roadway.
They couldn't get to the house. The house was on fire.
So we got out and we approached the scene. My dad, who was the assistant fire chief, instructed us to take a hose line up on the roof.
There are flames happening in different parts of the house, and the firefighters are putting out the flames.
And then my dad climbed up the ladder, and he told me, I want you two to stay up here until I tell you to come down. And it seemed kind of strange to me, and so I said to him, why? He said, because there are 5 bodies in the pool.
Bodies literally floating in the swimming pool. It was very eerie.
Pretty, I think, you know, to this day, I can still kind of visualize that.
It happened sometime during the dinner hour on the eye surgeon's $150,000 estate. Everyone in the house methodically murdered The only survivors, the Oda's 2 teenage daughters who were away at school.
I was back at boarding school, and I was woken up by one of the nuns and told that I needed to go home. And it was certainly not what I could have ever imagined. When I walked outside, it was just barely sunrise, and all the nuns from the entire school were standing outside. They had to tell me in the car that my family had died. It was unthinkable. And then they had to tell me how.
5 people had been killed. Dr. Oda, his wife, secretary, and 2 of his children. They had been executed and somehow thrown, pushed, or dumped into the swimming pool, and then the house was set on fire.
Dr. Ota had been shot 3 times. The 2 women and the boys had each been shot once in the head.
All of the bodies were found in the pool. They were tied with silk scarves.
The murder sent shockwaves through California and beyond.
When this crime happened, people were just stunned.
Dr. Victor Ota and his family lived in this house on a hill. None of the neighbors saw or heard anything. Police today were searching the area. They believe there must have been more than one killer, but they have very few leads.
Dr. Oda was such a well-regarded figure in the community, and nearly an entire family was killed in one event. It just paralyzed this community.
The burden was on the sheriff's department to unravel the mystery.
This is where this heinous crime took place. We had police cars, fire engines, the media, trying to keep people away from the house.
As the crime scene was searched, a clue surfaced.
Not too far from where I am, straight up past this switchback, was one of the cars that blocked the fire engines from getting in to put out the fire.
And tucked beneath the windscreen wiper, detectives made their chilling find.
There was a weird development in the case. A strange note was found at the scene indicating the killings had been done by a group calling itself the Free People of the Universe, who have declared World War III against anybody who misuses the environment.
Composed on the AutoZone typewriter, the note began. Halloween, 1970. Today, World War III will begin as brought to you by the people of the free universe. From this day forward, anyone and/or company of persons who misuses the natural environment or destroys same will suffer the penalty of death. The note was signed Knight of Wands, Knight of Cups, Knight of Pentacles, Knight of Swords.
The note, once it was the contents released, really scared people.
It made people right away think about Charlie Manson, Kate LaBianca, Helter Skelter. Those of us in the sheriff's office thought we were dealing with a big group of people that were hell-bent on killing people.
I'd never been associated with firearms. The first thing I did was I went down to the local cigar store and bought myself a weapon.
We never used to lock our doors. But when this happened, we started locking our doors. I actually slept with a shotgun alongside my bed.
Oh yeah, the doors were locked and the guns were loaded.
Within 24 hours, there was a new development. Whoever had slain the family had stolen one of their cars, and now it reappeared in a nearby railway tunnel, along with a sighting nearby of 3 suspicious hippies.
A train came along and hit the car, and now we are rushing to the tunnel to find out what kind of information on this murder case can this car give us.
The vehicle was still warm, so there was thought it was recent, and therefore the people, the suspects, may be still in the area.
So then we started looking for who put the car in the tunnel on these tracks. We put together this extensive perimeter around what is known as Henry Cowell Park. It is huge. This is a dense redwood forest. It goes down into a gorge where the San Lorenzo River runs and then goes up the other side.
I, along with probably at least 100 or more other officers, began searching.
We had California Highway Patrol, Santa Cruz County Sheriff, Santa Cruz Police. We had people from everywhere. We were borrowing helicopters from the San Francisco Bay Area.
I was leading one of those teams because I was familiar with the trails up there, but it was really a long shot that we would find someone. The area is overgrown with redwoods and brush, and easy for them to hear us coming, easy for them to hide.
Despite the massive search, the cult killers couldn't be found, and as panic spread through the Santa Cruz community, talk of a war between straight society and the hippies began.
Hippie communes began in the woods around here. There are many of them. A person with long hair lately around here has been feeling the heat.
It's this look of distrust, we just can't trust these people, you know, they're afraid of us.
This was the first time anything like that had happened in Santa Cruz County. And I think that the town really got paranoid.
Many people are talking of setting up vigilante groups. They're buying guns and ammunition.
People would say, well, we'd like to lynch long hairs. We don't think our community needs them.
But when details of the note reached long-haired local Roger Crone, what came to mind was not a cult, but his neighbor, a reclusive 24-year-old, John Linley Frazier.
Facts came out about the Otis slaying, and they just fell, everything about that fell right in line with what he had been telling us 3 days before.
Roger and his friends lived in a selection of old farm buildings in the woods, not far from the Ota family home.
John camped out over in this cabin across the ravine, and he was living off the land for the most part. He was as close to a survivalist as you could get for the time. He had a look about him. He was so serious, and he seemed really skeptical of everything. So, you know, there was part of me that feared him, always. When my friend Michael Madden and I were at work, he had a conversation with the girls that lived in the house, too. He'd been talking about the book of Revelations and the fact that he felt he was here to save the environment, and that people who were polluting it or who were abusing it needed to be dealt with. Either you were in with him or you had to go.
Against all expectations, the so-called People of the Free Universe was not a killer cult, but a lone assassin on a mission from God. And he was armed and on the loose. In October 1970, Dr. Victor Ota his wife Virginia, their 2 sons, Derek and Taggart, and Dr. Ota's secretary, Dorothy Cadwallader, had been bound with scarves, shot in the head, and dumped in the family's swimming pool. After the discovery of a note referencing the occult, California feared another murderous Manson-like hippie cult. But local resident Roger Crone recognized the note as the work of his reclusive neighbor, 24-year-old John Linley Frazier. A raid on his property was quickly organized.
We met at the Sheriff's Department and put our team together, told who we were looking for, and we went up to the Soquel foothills. I think apprehensive is a good word. Not knowing what you're going to get into, what you're going to run up against. You know you can't make any mistakes because that could cost you dearly. We worked our way up kind of a ravine to a very precarious footbridge, a couple of cables with boards laid on it, to a shack that was on the far side of this gully.
But the shack was empty, and Frazier was nowhere to be found. Rod Sandford and his fellow deputy Brad Arbsland were instructed to stake out the property overnight.
We decided to work our way up on a little hillside above the buildings and hunker down for the night. Before we went up there, I had set some little traps, just using some of the old twigs and branches that are here that would indicate if something or someone had come through that trail during the nighttime. You'd take something like this. The trail was here. He'd just set a piece across. And that was something just as simple as that, so that when someone or something walked by, they'd kick it down, knock it down, disturb it. I knew that raccoons, skunks, deer, anything would set off the ones on the trail, but on the bridge, I laid a very small piece of a branch, actually, and I knew that when somebody walked on it, the cables would move up and down, the branch would fall through, I'd know somebody crossed it. It wouldn't have been an animal. And then in the door on the far side in his shack, inside the door, I set up another little small twig that if the door was opened, it would fall out towards us. It was a sleepless night because you knew what this person did, and you knew that if they came along, in our mind at least, they wouldn't go easy. So in the morning, at daybreak, we started going down the trails towards the shack. We noticed that the traps had been set off on the trails, and I knew then that someone had gone across the bridge. And when we looked across at the cabin, we could see that the small little stick that had been indoors was now outside. So now we know that someone has come across the cable and the door had been opened and closed. So then the dilemma was, one of us had to go across the bridge while the other one covered him. There was some discussion then because whoever went out on that drawbridge was a sitting duck. You had no cover, you were wide open. I don't know how it happened, but I was the one that went across the bridge and Brad covered me. And that wasn't much fun. It was not a solid bridge. If you stepped in the wrong place, you'd cause a board to fly and you'd go down. Going across knowing that this guy had killed 5 people, and if he had a gun and realized we were coming, he might start shooting and there was nowhere to go. You're wondering if that door is going to fly open. So I went across the bridge, then I covered, he came across the bridge. Once he got here, there was nowhere else for us to go. The door was here. So there was nothing to do but open that door quickly and go through. You do is you get one on either side of the door, one pulls the door, and in you go. What we noticed immediately is there was sleeping bags, maybe blankets, but there was a stack of things in the middle of the room that hadn't been there the day before. I looked at Brad, he looked at me, he grabbed the sleeping bags, yanked them back. I had the shotgun, and there was Frazier. Stuck the shotgun in his face and told him, "Don't move or I'll shoot." Kind of had this weird smile, looked at me and said, "Why don't you give me what I deserve?" And I'll tell you what, the thought runs through your mind, but that's not our job.
Two of our deputy sheriffs, Brad Armsland and Rod Sanford, found the suspect Frazier asleep. This warrant charges the suspect with 5 counts of murder.
So who was this lone assassin, seemingly capable of the cold execution of either man, woman or child? And why had he targeted the 5 innocents at the Ota residence?
The first time that I laid eyes on John Linley Frazier was in the jail cell. And he was clearly strange, very uncooperative.
He was just, I don't know, weird, as best I can describe it. He wouldn't say anything, wouldn't say anything to anybody.
It was down to defense investigator Harold Cartwright to try to unravel the mysteries of Frazier's mind.
I commenced an investigation and trying to figure out what made him tick.
John Frazier's parents had separated when he was 2. By the time he was 5, his mother, unable to support herself and care for him, had placed him in a foster home.
I think Frazier had a very unstable childhood and a sense of insecurity. I think he did not feel safe. And when a child does not feel safe, they tend to start developing mechanisms to survive and to adapt, and sometimes those mechanisms are pretty maladaptive. So I assume that he probably had a rigid temperament where somebody is not able to absorb frustration or disappointment, and they begin to get angry over it. And it isn't just anger, it sits in their stomach like an undigested rock.
The young Frazier earned convictions for burglary and escape from a juvenile facility. But by his late teens, he appeared to be settling down. He married his wife, Dolores, when he was 21, and in 1965, they had a child.
I remember speaking to his ex-employer at an auto repair shop, and he spoke very highly of John, thought he was an excellent mechanic.
But in Frazier's early 20s, he began to change.
In 1969, his wife noticed that he seemed to be having delusions.
She told me that he would go off into the woods and take his Bible, and that sometimes she wouldn't see him for 2 or 3 days at a time, but that he was never unkind to her, loved his daughter. He just became a different person.
John Linley Frazier was showing signs of schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia is a major mental illness characterized mainly by a disorder of thought, a disorder of thinking. It usually begins in late adolescence, early adulthood, 19, 20, when the first psychotic episode begins. But prior to that, there's a pre-morbid condition where the individual is usually withdrawn and odd and somewhat bizarre in a number of different ways.
In 1970, Frazier's strange behavior escalated.
He quit his job. He felt that combustion engines were destroying the environment, and he didn't feel that he could be a party to that any longer.
Then, on Independence Day, 3 months before the slaying at the Ota residence, Frazier separated from his family and began living in a dilapidated cowshed in the woods. There he developed an obsession with the dark preoccupations of the time, the occult, numerology, levitation, and the apocalyptic messages of the Book of Revelations.
He might have been what we call a schizotypal personality disorder, where magical thinking is part of the process, where he was getting very involved in the tarot. And at that time, the hippie movement was becoming much more into very spiritualistic philosophies, and he did not have voices of stability around him.
Neighbour Roger Crone was unnerved by Frazier's odd behaviour.
The couple got married while we were living here, and they had the wedding up on the ridge, and John showed up wearing an American flag. It was indicative of the fact that he was a little bit strange. John was kind of reclusive, hard person to get to know, really. He was intimidating, real kind of hard eyes. The intensity with which he would look at you always kind of scared me.
Frazier holed himself up in his shack in the forests of California, protected by a steep ravine and a deliberately precarious bridge. There were rumors the cabin was booby-trapped against intruders.
I didn't come into this part of the property ever, so I never fell victim to one of his booby traps. Yeah, he was definitely paranoid.
But Frazier wasn't just odd. He was a man on a mission, and his plan chilled listeners to the bone.
He had an epiphany. He'd been reading the Bible and the Book of Revelations, and he thought it was his job to come and save the planet.
He explained to me that God had spoken to him, and he had been chosen to restore the earth to its natural state. This entailed removing all vehicles and buildings from the earth. His job, under God's instruction, was to give each head of household the option of choosing God's army or death.
He said he was going to go door to door like the Avon lady and said, "Ding dong, you're dead." The little laugh at the end of it is what really did. It was chilling.
It was in October 1970, with Halloween approaching, that Frazier decided it was time to carry out his divine duty.
What emerged was this motive, as John Linley Frazier saw it, evidence of materialism through the Otis. Their house was too big. It had a swimming pool. It was opulent. They had too many cars.
On a hill, not more than half a mile from his ramshackle hut, stood the Ota family's dream home.
When he arrived, he found Mrs. Ota and the youngest son. He found some scarves, and he tied her up, did the same with the younger boy, and they waited. Next, Dorothy Cadwallader, who worked for the doctor, brought the oldest boy home from school, and he went through the same procedure again. And then when Dr. Ota came, he tied his hands behind him, explained to him what he had been instructed to do by God.
He had him at gunpoint and wanted Mr. Ota, the head of the family, to join him and burn the house down. Of course, Dr. Ota wasn't going to burn his house down.
So Dr. Ota is calling him a crazy, stupid, drugged-out hippie, whatever, not very cooperative. So at some point, he pushes Dr. Ota into the swimming pool. He's using the leaf skimmer to hold him down and bring him up, trying to convince him to burn down the house and join God's army. After a period of time, in Frazier's mind, he had convinced the doctor, and so as he extended his hand to pull Dr. Ota out of the swimming pool, Dr. Ota tried to pull him into the swimming pool, and he failed. So at that point, Frazier shot the doctor. Then he went in and got the wife, brought her out, executed her. then Dorothy Cadwallader executed her. He talked about how difficult it was for him to kill the kids. He talked about having this argument with God. Why do these children have to die? They're innocent. They've done nothing wrong. They've not harmed the environment. But God insisted that they must die.
Frazier shot both boys in the head and dumped them in the pool.
He felt that our family were capitalist pigs that had raped the environment, things that were almost ironic in that there were no trees cut down, and we had made this piece of land more beautiful. And if you knew the Japanese culture and the culture that my parents and family lived by, it was so completely opposite of what he had felt he was attacking. So it was amazingly sad.
But the bizarre story of John Frazier did not end with his capture. His trial would deliver one of the most extraordinary moments in criminal history. In October 1971, the trial of John Linley Frazier for the slaying of the Ota family and their secretary began. The evidence that Frazier had committed the crimes was overwhelming. But would he be judged insane at the time of his murders? If so, his future would be hospital instead of jail. From the outset, his behavior was unnerving.
My housemates and I did testify at the trial. That was scary too. He glowered at me. Right. I avoided looking at him as much as possible.
Frequently, Frazier would seem blank or disinterested.
The only time in my testimony that I saw any reaction on his part was when Pete Chang asked me about that statement, and I said that he said, "Why don't you give me what I deserve?" And he perked up, and you could see that he was disturbed.
The flattened affect and the appearance of total emotional detachment is a sign of schizophrenia, but I wouldn't eliminate other motives as well, that he doesn't care about anything, because I don't think he did. It's important, I think, when someone's diagnosed as having a major mental illness, not to assume that everything he does is a direct result of mental illness, because it is not.
So might there have been another influence at play alongside Frazier's schizophrenia?
He did all this around the same time Charles Manson's trial was going on, right around that time period. And I would not be surprised if he was influenced by it in some way.
The whole thing with Manson was that somebody's got to start the violence so that all the rest of the people who will be part of this uprising know that that's the signal, and they'll come together in one great big army. So that was already in the air. What happens with people of this mentality, whether it's schizotypal or schizophrenia, is they absorb, and certain things stand out to them as significant, and I would think that that would be one of them.
On the first day of his sanity hearing, John Linley Frazier made the kind of entrance that Charles Manson himself might have been proud of.
They brought John Linley Frazier into the courtroom from the back, and everything looked normal. And when he turned to go sit next to his lawyer, the entire half of his head and face was shaved.
He had actually gone, even with his nose, up through the top of his head, down through his beard, saved one eyebrow, one side of his face, and one side of his head. And it was shaved.
And he would sit at the table and kind of turn one way and show the audience that perspective. and he would turn the other way and show a different person.
And of course, the press started talking about this conflict between good and evil. It certainly, in my opinion, didn't help his defense in any way.
We finally decided that it might be better if he shaved everything off rather than sitting in there acting like he was a schizophrenic, which I guess was the idea.
Frazier had reportedly told others that he would prefer to go to the gas chamber than be sent to a fascist head factory.
That was one of the more interesting aspects of the trial, is he did not want to be found insane. So he was a psychotic individual pretending to be sane, pretending to be psychotic to convince the jury that he was malingering his psychosis so that they would convict him and send him to prison, not send him to a psychiatric institution.
Frazier got his wish. He was judged legally sane at the time he committed his crimes and sentenced to death, later reduced to life imprisonment. But was murder really his destiny? Was John Linley Frazier a born killer?
I do not think John Linley Frazier was born to kill. I think despite having an illness, if he had not had certain influences, especially in the culture in his life, he might certainly have done anything but commit this violent crime. So no, I think it was a number of circumstances from the environment that really steered him toward the violence that he did, rather than something organic to him.
It was a progression. He became ill, and as time went by, he became sicker and sicker, and unfortunately, he didn't get help, and it ended in a horrible tragedy.
I was angry at the situation. I'm angry that I don't have my family. I'm more angry that they suffered, most of all. And that part I'm furious and angry and sad about, but I'm not, to feel that way towards him, just didn't feel natural to me. Who would choose to have that? Who would choose to be born that way? Nobody could do such a thing that didn't have something broken in their chromosomes, in their DNA somewhere. Something to me would have to be broken to commit such a crime.
In August 2009, after 39 years behind bars, John Linley Frazier hung himself in his cell.
My impression was that he was sort of horrified that he was capable of doing something like this. But at the same time, this was a burden that was placed on him by God.